Welcome, traveler. Come in, take a seat by the fire, and make yourself comfortable. Tonight I have a story for you. A story from an old mountain inn about a small brass bell that rang only at midnight. This is the midnight bell. There are sounds that disappear as soon as they are heard. A cup placed gently on a wooden table, a loose shutter moving once in the wind, the last step of a traveler passing beyond the light of a doorway. And then there are sounds that remain with us for years. For me, it was the sound of a small brass bell, rung once at midnight in an old mountain inn. I heard it on 3 winter nights when I was still a young man. At the time, I believed the innkeeper was calling to someone outside. Later, I thought he might have been warning something away. I was wrong on both counts. It took me many years to understand why he rang that bell, and even now, there is one part of the story I cannot explain. I had been traveling for several days when the weather changed. The morning had begun with a pale sky and a light dusting of snow along the road. By afternoon, the hills had vanished behind the grey curtain, and the path beneath my feet had narrowed to 2 uncertain lines between the trees. The snow itself was not violent. It fell quietly, almost politely, but it did not stop. It settled on my shoulders, filled the folds of my coat, and softened every familiar shape. Stones became small white mounds. Fence posts became bent figures watching from the roadside. Even the sound of my own steps seemed to come from somewhere behind me. I had expected to reach a village before dark. Instead, I found myself standing at a fork in the road, with no sign, no house, and no clear memory of which direction I had been told to take. I chose the wider path. For the next hour, I saw nothing except trees and snow. The light faded. My hands stiffened inside my sleeves. I began to consider spending the night beneath a small wooden shelter I had passed earlier, though it had no walls and offered little protection from the wind. Then I saw a light. It was no brighter than a candle seen through several layers of paper, but it was steady. It did not flicker like a lantern carried by a traveler. It remained in the same place as I approached, growing slowly warmer through the falling snow. The building stood a short distance from the road. It was long and low, with a dark wooden roof covered in a smooth white layer. A row of paper-covered windows glowed along the front. Beside the entrance hung a weathered sign painted with a single image of a pine branch. There was no name that I could read. A small brass bell hung beneath the edge of the roof. It moved slightly in the wind, but it made no sound. I climbed the 2 steps to the entrance and knocked. The door opened before my hand had fully lowered. A young woman stood inside holding a lamp. She wore a plain grey robe with the sleeves tied back for work. A folded cloth rested over one shoulder, and there was a pale line of flour across the side of her hand. "You are late," she said. It was not a question, and it was not spoken unkindly. "I may also be lost," I replied. "That happens here." She stepped aside. Warm air moved over me. It carried the smell of burning wood, steamed rice, wet wool, lamp oil, and something sweet simmering in a covered pot. I removed my boots and placed them beside several other pairs near the entrance. Each pair was arranged with the toes facing the door, ready for its owner to leave. Mine were so covered in snow that the young woman carried them to a shallow tray near the stove. The main room was larger than I had expected. Low tables stood across woven floor mats. A square hearth had been built into the center of the floor, and an iron kettle hung above it from a dark wooden beam. 3 travelers sat close to the fire. One was an old merchant with narrow shoulders and a red scarf wrapped twice around his neck. Beside him sat a broad-faced man who repaired cooking knives for a living. The third was a widow traveling to live with her eldest son. She held a small cloth bundle on her lap and kept one hand resting on it, even while drinking tea. None of them seemed surprised to see me. The young woman pointed toward an empty place near the hearth. "Sit there. I will bring something warm." I thanked her and lowered myself beside the fire. The room contained hundreds of small details that became clearer as warmth returned to my hands. Shelves along one wall held ceramic bowls of many shapes, none of them matching. A row of lamps had been cleaned and placed upside down on a cloth. Wooden pegs supported coats, hats, travel bags, and bundles tied with cord. Near the stairs stood a narrow cabinet with dozens of shallow drawers, each marked by a hand-painted symbol. Above the cabinet was a small wooden horse. It was no longer than my palm. One wheel was missing, and the paint had faded from its back. Someone had tied a fresh piece of blue thread around its neck. The young woman returned with a bowl of soup, rice, and pickled vegetables. She placed a cup of tea beside them. "The pass is closed," she said. "You will stay at least 2 nights." I had hoped to leave in the morning. So did everyone else. The knife repairer laughed. The old merchant lifted his cup. "The mountain has made your decision for you." A door opened at the far end of the room, and the innkeeper entered carrying a stack of folded bedding. He was a quiet man, perhaps 50 years old, with silver beginning at his temples. His clothes were simple and carefully mended. A ring of keys hung at his side, although I later noticed that very few doors in the inn were locked. He placed the bedding on a bench and greeted me with a small bow. "You found us at a good time," he said. I was beginning to think I would find nothing at all. That is usually when people arrive. He asked no more questions. He did not ask where I had come from, what business had brought me into the mountains, or how much money I carried. He simply told the young woman to prepare the room at the end of the upper hall. Then he looked at me again. "There is one thing you should know," he said. "At midnight, you may hear a bell." I waited for him to continue. "Do not be alarmed. It is not meant for the guests." The knife repairer lowered his eyes into his tea. The widow tightened her hand around the bundle in her lap. Only the old merchant smiled. I asked, "Who is it meant for?" The innkeeper picked up the folded bedding. "That depends on whom you ask." He carried the bedding upstairs. No one explained further. After eating, I helped move my wet coat closer to the stove. The young woman showed me to my room. It was small, clean, and almost empty. A rolled mattress waited inside a cupboard. A low table stood beneath the window, with a lamp, a water cup, and a square wooden box for personal belongings. On the wall hung a painting of 3 birds resting on a bare branch. There were 4 shadows beneath them. I noticed this only because the lamp stood close to the picture. I leaned forward, wondering whether the 4th shape was a stain, but the young woman had already begun unfolding the mattress. "Was this painted for the inn?" I asked. "It has always been here." "Do you know why there are 4 shadows?" She glanced at the picture. "There are only 3 now." Before I could ask what she meant, she stood and moved toward the door. "If you need water, leave the cup outside." If you hear steps in the hall, they may belong to another guest. May, she gave me the faintest suggestion of a smile. The floors are old, and she closed the door. I slept for several hours. When I woke, the lamp had burned low. The room was cold enough that I could see a trace of my breath. Somewhere below, a piece of wood shifted in the hearth. I did not know the time. Then the bell rang. It was a small sound, clear and gentle. One note, neither loud nor sharp, followed by a silence that seemed to fill the whole building. I sat up. A door moved downstairs. Wind entered the inn with a soft rush, carrying the dry whisper of snow across the entrance boards. I heard no voices. No one knocked. No traveler called from the road. The front door remained open for several seconds. Then it closed. The floor creaked in the hall outside my room. One step, another, a third, lighter than the first two. The sound stopped beside my door. I held my breath, though I could not have explained why. The innkeeper had told me not to be alarmed. Nothing about the sound felt threatening. Still, there is something strange about hearing footsteps pause where no one has reason to stand. After a moment, the steps continued toward the stairs. I heard them descend. Then came the faint wooden rattle of something rolling across the floor below. In the morning, the small wooden horse was no longer on the cabinet. It stood in the center of the nearest table, facing the fire. The old merchant sat beside it, eating rice from a bowl. "Did you move that?" I asked. He looked at the horse as though he had only just noticed it. "No. Someone did. Someone often does." The young woman entered carrying hot water. She picked up the horse and returned it to the cabinet without comment. At breakfast, I asked about the bell. The knife repairer immediately became interested in the contents of his bowl. The widow looked towards the innkeeper, who was counting small coins at a desk near the wall. The old merchant answered me. "There has always been a child in this inn," he said. I looked toward the young woman. "Not her," he added. "An unseen one." The young woman placed the kettle down harder than necessary. The merchant continued. "Some houses have mice, some have leaking roofs. This one has a child who cannot be seen. You speak as though it is ordinary. I have stayed here for 40 winters. Ordinary is simply what continues long enough." The widow leaned slightly closer. "My mother told me that such a spirit brings good fortune to a house," she said. "If it is content, the family prospers. If it leaves, everything begins to fail." The knife repairer finally looked up. "My grandfather said that was invented by innkeepers who wanted travelers to pay for rooms with noisy floors." The old merchant ignored him. "People have heard running in the upper hall when every room was empty," he said. "They have found small handprints on the windows. Food disappears. Toys move. Once, a guest woke to find that every knot in his travel bag had been untied." "Was anything stolen?" I asked. "Nothing. His socks were folded more neatly than before." The widow smiled into her tea. I asked whether anyone had ever seen the spirit. The merchant rubbed the side of his cup with one thumb. "My wife said she saw a child sitting at the top of the stairs many years ago. Dark hair, red sleeves, bare feet. She looked away to call me, and when she looked back, the stairs were empty." "Did she believe it was a ghost?" "She believed it was a child." There was a difference in the way he said it. The innkeeper closed his account book. "That is enough for breakfast," he said. The merchant nodded and returned to his rice. The rest of the morning passed in the quiet work of a place waiting for the road to reopen. The young woman swept melted snow from the entrance and spread the wet floor cloth near the stove. The innkeeper inspected a crack in one of the window frames and filled it with a narrow strip of folded paper. The knife repairer offered to sharpen the kitchen blades in exchange for part of his lodging. The widow sat near the light and repaired a tear in the lining of her coat. I had no useful trade to offer, so I helped where I could. The innkeeper gave me a box of lamp parts. Each lamp had to be taken apart, wiped free of soot, and fitted with a new length of wick. The glass chimneys were thin and slightly uneven. Some held tiny bubbles from the day they had been made. Do not polish them until they look new, he told me. Old glass gives a softer light. On another table, the young woman sorted bowls. She set aside those with chips along the rim, but she did not throw them away. Instead, she marked each one with a dot of black ink on the bottom. What are those for? I asked. Travelers who cannot pay. Why give them damaged bowls? So we remember not to charge them. She turned over one bowl. Its rim had been repaired with a thin dark seam. This one belonged to a man who arrived during a storm with no money and no shoes. He returned the next year with 6 new bowls. We still use all of them. Near midday, the innkeeper prepared a tray with a small bowl of rice, a slice of cooked root, and a cup no larger than a walnut shell. He placed it on the lowest shelf beneath the wooden horse. For the child? I asked. For whoever is hungry. Does the food disappear? Sometimes. Who eats it? He looked toward the kitchen where the young woman was rolling dough. That depends on whom you ask. It was becoming clear that this was his favorite answer. The snow continued through the afternoon. No new travelers arrived. The room grew warm enough that the widow loosened the scarf around her shoulders. The knife repairer worked steadily, drawing each blade across a stone with a soft repeating sound. The old merchant told stories. Most concerned roads that no longer existed, bridges carried away by floods, and inns where he had once been given meals so poor that even the dogs refused his leftovers. Yet whenever he spoke about the mountain inn, his voice changed. He knew which stair complained in wet weather, which lamp smoked when the oil was low, and which corner of the main room stayed warm longest after the fire had faded. You speak as though this is your home, I said. It is one of them. How many homes does a merchant have? As many as will remember his usual cup. The young woman, without looking over, reached to the shelf and brought him a green cup with a crack near the handle. He raised it in proof. That evening the wind weakened. Snow still touched the windows, but the building no longer seemed surrounded by emptiness. It felt occupied in ways I could see and ways I could not. A coat shifted on its peg when no one passed it. A drawer in the cabinet stood open after the young woman had closed it. The wooden horse appeared near the stairs, then later beneath the old merchant's chair. No one reacted with fear. They reacted as people do when a familiar member of the household has entered the room without speaking. Shortly before midnight, the innkeeper checked the front door. He lifted the wooden bar, examined the hinges, and brushed a little snow from the threshold. The brass bell from beneath the roof now rested in his hand. I had assumed he rang it where it hung. Instead, he removed it each night and carried it inside. The bell was old. Its surface had darkened except where generations of fingers had held it. Around its handle, someone had wrapped a narrow piece of cloth. The innkeeper stood beside the entrance. The other guests continued preparing for bed, but they did so more quietly. He rang the bell once. The clear note rose through the room. Then he opened the door. Cold air moved over the floor. The fire bent toward the entrance. Snowflakes crossed the threshold and disappeared almost at once. The innkeeper stepped aside. He did not look outside. He faced into the room, leaving the doorway completely unobstructed. No one entered. No one left. After several breaths, he closed the door and returned the wooden bar to its place. The old merchant carried his cup to the kitchen. The widow went upstairs. The knife repairer rolled his tools into a cloth. I remained near the fire. The innkeeper set the bell on the desk. "Is it a signal?" I asked. "Yes." "To the spirit?" "To anyone who understands it." "What does it mean?" He adjusted one of the coins in the open account book, aligning it with the others. "The door is open. That much is clear. Then you understand the signal." I waited, but he said nothing more. The next morning, the weather improved enough for the knife repairer to leave. He wrapped his tools, paid for his lodging, and placed 2 sharpened kitchen blades on the counter as a gift. Before stepping outside, he turned toward the cabinet. "Tell your little helper not to hide my polishing cloth next time." The young woman crossed her arms. "It was in your sleeve." Exactly where no reasonable person would put it. He bowed to the room and went out into the white morning. The widow left an hour later in the company of 2 farmers traveling toward the next village. Before she went, she placed a small paper flower beside the wooden horse. "For luck?" I asked. "For thanks." "Did something happen?" She considered the question. "I slept well," she said. By noon, only the old merchant and I remained as guests. The pass was still closed to carts, and the innkeeper advised me not to travel alone. I did not argue. The truth was that I had become curious enough to welcome another night. That afternoon, while helping carry firewood from the rear shed, I noticed marks carved into the upper frame of the back door. They were small symbols, nearly hidden beneath layers of smoke and age. Some had been scratched out, others had been cut so deeply that the wood had split around them. I asked the young woman what they meant. She balanced 3 pieces of wood against her hip. "Old protections." "Against what?" "Against leaving." I thought I had misheard her. "Against something entering?" "No." She carried the wood inside. I followed her to the kitchen. "Who carved them?" "The innkeeper's father, and his father before him." "Why would they try to prevent the spirit from leaving?" She placed the wood beside the stove. "You heard the merchant. The family believed its presence brought good fortune. So they trapped it here." "They tried. Did it work?" She glanced toward the ceiling as a light series of steps crossed the room above us. "I suppose that depends on what you call good fortune." The steps stopped. A moment later, a wooden spoon fell from a hook on the far wall. The young woman picked it up and returned it to its place. "The inn was once much larger," she said. "There were more rooms, more servants, more expensive food. Rich travelers came from far away because they had heard the stories. They wanted to sleep beneath the same roof as a spirit that could make them fortunate. What happened? The family became afraid of losing it." She wiped the spoon with her sleeve. "They sealed unused doors. They hung cords across windows. They counted the toys each morning and each night. When a servant left, they searched her bags to make certain the spirit had not hidden inside. That sounds less like an inn than a prison. The young woman looked toward the main room, where the innkeeper sat repairing the binding of an old book. That is what he thought. Later, the old merchant told me the rest. We sat beside the hearth while the innkeeper worked at his desk. The merchant spoke quietly, though I suspected every word could be heard across the room. The innkeeper was the younger son, he said. His brother was meant to inherit the business. The elder brother believed every story about the spirit. He slept with the account books beside his bed and checked the doors 3 times each night. Was the inn prosperous? Very. Then perhaps he had reason to believe. The merchant shook his head. The rooms were full. The family was miserable. He told me that the elder brother had expanded the inn until the building became difficult to heat. He borrowed money to add rooms for wealthy guests. He bought fine dishes but charged servants for breaking them. He purchased silk bedding and locked it away so carefully that no one was permitted to use it. Every improvement was made in the name of protecting good fortune. Then, one winter, the innkeeper's father became ill. The elder brother left to bring a physician through the snow. He never returned. They found his travel bag in the spring, the merchant said. Nothing else. The family waited. The business weakened. Creditors came, servants left. Part of the roof collapsed beneath heavy snow. The younger son inherited what remained. Everyone said the spirit had gone. The merchant continued. They said it had taken the family fortune with it. Had it? The merchant looked toward the wooden horse. It now stood on the floor beside the innkeeper's desk. The footsteps never stopped. That evening, I found the innkeeper alone in the main room. The old merchant had gone to bed early. The young woman was washing bowls in the kitchen. The innkeeper sat beside the hearth, holding the small brass bell. I lowered myself across from him. Your family tried to keep the spirit here, I said. He turned the bell slowly in his hands. Yes. And you opened the door every night? Yes. Why at midnight? Because that was when my father used to check the locks. The answer was so simple that I said nothing. He continued. When I was a boy, midnight was the hour when the house became quiet. My father walked from door to door. He touched every cord, every seal, every latch. If he found a window open, he woke the servant responsible. If a toy was missing, we searched until morning. Did you believe the spirit would escape? I believed my father was frightened. The fire settled between us. The innkeeper rubbed his thumb across the worn cloth around the bell's handle. After my brother disappeared, my father said the spirit had punished us. Then he said it had abandoned us. Then he said we had failed to guard it. Each explanation made him more certain that the doors must remain closed. What did you think? I thought my brother had walked into a storm because he believed money could protect our family from every ordinary sorrow. The young woman stopped washing bowls. The room became very still. The innkeeper placed the bell between us. When my father died, I removed the cords. I opened the sealed windows. I burned most of the old protections. On the first night at midnight, I rang this bell and opened the front door. Were you trying to drive the spirit away? No. To invite it to leave? He looked at me then. A guest who is not free to leave is no longer a guest. The sentence remained in the room longer than the sound of the bell had. I looked toward the stairs. And if it leaves, then it was never ours to keep. What if the inn loses its good fortune? The innkeeper smiled, though there was sadness in it. We lost our good fortune while trying to lock it inside. From the kitchen came the soft clink of one bowl placed inside another. I asked, "Has the spirit ever walked out?" "That depends on whom you ask." This time I understood why he answered that way. That night I did not go upstairs immediately. I sat in the main room with a blanket around my shoulders. The lamp beside the desk had been lowered. The fire was little more than a bed of red coals. Near the cabinet, the wooden horse stood beside the small bowl prepared earlier that day. The rice was gone. The innkeeper emerged from the kitchen a few minutes before midnight. He did not seem surprised to find me awake. "You wish to see?" he asked. "I wish to listen." He nodded. The young woman stood at the foot of the stairs. She held no lamp. The old merchant remained somewhere above us, though I wondered whether he too was awake behind his door. The innkeeper lifted the wooden bar. He took the bell in his hand. For the first time I noticed a tiny mark engraved near its rim. It looked like a doorway, or perhaps two lines meeting beneath a roof. The innkeeper rang the bell. One clear note. He opened the door. The winter night waited beyond it. Snow had stopped falling. A pale light lay across the road. The air entering the room was cold but calm. The innkeeper stepped aside. We waited. At first I heard nothing. Then a floorboard moved upstairs. A second board answered. Light footsteps crossed the upper hall. They reached the stairs. One step descended, then another. The sound was too small for an adult, and too measured for a falling object. It came slowly, one step at a time, until it reached the main room. The wooden horse rolled forward. It crossed the floor by less than the length of a hand, then stopped. The young woman lowered her eyes. The footsteps moved toward the entrance. They stopped before the open door. The innkeeper did not turn. He continued facing into the room, giving the unseen visitor a clear path. The night beyond the threshold seemed impossibly wide. I imagined the road, the buried fields, the dark line of the trees, and every house that might exist beyond them. I wondered what freedom meant to something that had lived beneath one roof longer than anyone could remember. The footsteps moved again. One soft step reached the threshold. Then there was silence. The lamp flame trembled. A little snow crossed the entrance and melted on the boards. Somewhere above us, wood shifted as the building cooled. The footsteps returned. They moved away from the door, crossed the main room, and stopped beside the hearth. At that moment, the wooden horse tipped onto its side. The young woman released a breath that might have been a quiet laugh. The innkeeper waited several more seconds. Then he closed the door. He replaced the bar, set the bell on the desk, and knelt to place the wooden horse upright. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that would have improved the silence. In the morning, the path reopened. A group of travelers arrived from the opposite direction, carrying news that the road was safe. The inn filled with voices, wet boots, bundles, and requests for tea. The young woman moved quickly between the tables. The innkeeper added names to his book. The old merchant complained that someone had taken his usual place by the fire, though he was smiling when he said it. I packed my belongings. Before leaving, I placed payment beside the account book. The innkeeper counted it and pushed one coin back toward me. "You cleaned the lamps," he said. "Poorly." "Still, they are cleaner." I accepted the coin. At the entrance, I saw that my boots had been dried and brushed. The broken lace on one side had been replaced with blue thread. It was the same shade as the thread tied around the wooden horse. I looked toward the young woman. She was carrying a tray and did not appear to notice. The old merchant lifted his green cup to me. "Do not wait 40 winters before returning." "I will try not to." The innkeeper opened the door. Outside, the world had been remade in white. The road was visible again as a shallow line between the trees. Before I stepped out, I asked him one final question. "Why ring the bell? Why not simply open the door?" He considered this. "Because every guest deserves to know when it is time to choose." I left the inn and continued my journey. For many years I told no one about the footsteps. When I thought of the place, I remembered smaller things instead. The repaired bowls, the old merchant's cup, the black marks beneath dishes used for travelers who could not pay. The way the innkeeper stepped aside from the open door without looking to see whether anyone left. Life carried me far from the mountains. I married, I worked. I moved into houses that were larger than the room where I had slept, but rarely as warm. I collected objects, misplaced them, found them again, and slowly learned how easily a person can begin guarding things that were meant to be used. More than once, I remembered the innkeeper's family and their locked silk bedding. More than once, I opened a cupboard and wondered whether possession had quietly become another name for fear. The years passed. Then, during another winter, I found myself near the old road. I had not planned to return. A delayed cart and a washed-out bridge forced me to change my route. When a driver mentioned a mountain inn marked by a pine branch, I felt the memory of the bell before I fully understood his words. I followed the road alone. The building was smaller than I remembered. Part of the roof had been replaced. The sign beside the entrance was newly painted, though it still showed the same single pine branch. The row of paper-covered windows shone through the evening mist. The brass bell remained beneath the roof. It moved slightly in the wind. It made no sound. The door opened before I knocked. A woman stood inside, holding a lamp. For a moment I saw the young worker who had once told me I was late. Then I saw the silver in her hair and the fine lines beside her eyes. "You took your time," she said. I smiled. "I may also be lost." "That still happens here." She stepped aside. The main room had changed, but not completely. The hearth remained in the center. The shelves still held mismatched bowls. The repaired window frames carried the same soft light. The old merchant's green cup stood on the highest shelf. Beside it was the wooden horse. It now had 4 wheels. "You repaired it," I said. "No." "Who did?" She glanced toward the stairs. "That depends on whom you ask." I laughed and the room felt immediately familiar. The innkeeper had died 5 years earlier, she told me. He had remained healthy until the end and spent his final afternoon repairing a drawer that had never closed properly. After his death, she inherited the inn. "He left it to you?" "He said I already knew where everything belonged." "Did you?" "No, but I knew where to look." She gave me my old room at the end of the upper hall. The painting of the bird still hung on the wall. There were 3 birds on the branch and 3 shadows beneath them. I stood before it for some time, trying to remember whether I had imagined the fourth. At supper, only two other travelers shared the main room. A farmer transporting cloth sat near the entrance. A quiet young man carrying letters warmed his hands over the hearth. The new innkeeper prepared a small bowl of rice and placed it on the lowest shelf. The wooden horse stood beside it. "Do you still ring the bell?" I asked. Her hands paused. "No." "Why not?" "It was his promise, not mine." "Does the door still open at midnight?" "Not unless someone opens it." "And the footsteps?" She looked toward the young man with the letters, who seemed not to be listening. "The floors are old." After the other guests went upstairs, we sat beside the hearth. She told me that the inn had survived modestly. Some winters were good, others were difficult. No wealthy travelers came seeking supernatural fortune anymore. Most guests were farmers, workers, messengers, widows, and people who had chosen the wrong road. "We have enough," she said. The phrase sounded more peaceful than any claim of prosperity. I asked what had become of the small bell the old innkeeper carried. She pointed toward the desk. It hung from a wooden peg above the account book. The cloth around its handle had been replaced, but the metal was unchanged. "Has anyone rung it since he died?" "No." "Not even once?" She shook her head. "I thought about it on the first night. I stood beside the door with the bell in my hand, but I could not decide whether I was offering freedom or asking something to stay, so I put it back. Perhaps the meaning depends on the person hearing it." "Perhaps." The fire lowered. We wished each other good night. I returned to my room and slept. At midnight, the bell rang. The sound was exactly as I remembered it. One small, clear note. I opened my eyes. For a moment I was young again, sitting beneath a blanket in the main room, while an innkeeper stepped aside from an open door. Then I heard movement below. A wooden bar lifted. The front door opened. Wind entered the building. I left my room and walked quietly to the stairs. The new innkeeper stood at the entrance, holding a lamp. The bell remained on its peg above the desk. No one stood near it. Outside, through the moving snow, a figure approached the light. It was an old man carrying an empty basket. He had taken the wrong path after visiting his daughter, and had walked for hours in the dark. He said he had not seen the inn from the road. He had heard a bell, only one note, he told us, but it had come clearly through the wind. He followed the sound until he saw the light in the window. The innkeeper brought him inside. She removed his wet coat, placed his boots beside the stove, and prepared a bowl of soup. The old man sat near the hearth with both hands around the cup. While she worked, I looked toward the desk. The bell moved once on its peg, not enough to ring, just enough to turn the small engraved mark toward the room. Two lines meeting beneath a roof, the shape of an open doorway. The innkeeper noticed it too. She said nothing. Instead, she prepared a second small bowl and placed it on the lowest shelf beside the wooden horse. In the morning, the first bowl was empty. The second still held a little rice. The old man left after sunrise. Before stepping onto the road, he turned and bowed more deeply than custom required. "I would not have found you without the bell," he said. The innkeeper looked toward me. Then she looked toward the small brass bell beneath the roof, which had remained silent all morning. "Sometimes," she replied, "the house knows when someone is still outside." After he had gone, she removed the bell from the peg above the desk. She carried it to the entrance and held it for a long moment. "Will you ring it tonight?" I asked. She wrapped her fingers around the handle. "Yes." "For the child?" She opened the door and looked toward the road. "For anyone who needs to know the door is open." That was the last time I visited the inn. I do not know whether it still stands. Old roads vanish, roofs fail, families move away, the names of places fade from maps and from memory. But I have often thought about the bell. The innkeeper's ancestors believed good fortune was something that could be trapped inside a building. They sealed the windows, guarded the doors, and watched every shadow. In trying to keep their blessing, they made their home into a place where no one was truly free. The innkeeper chose something different. Every night, he opened the door. He offered the unseen child a path into the world, and the child chose the warmth of the hearth. Years later, when the bell rang on its own, it did not call good fortune back into the inn. It carried the inn's kindness outward through the snow to a traveler who might otherwise have remained lost. Perhaps that is what good fortune had always been. Not wealth, not a full account book, not a spirit held behind a locked door. Perhaps it was simply the ability to offer shelter and the wisdom to leave the door open freely. We spend much of our lives trying to hold on to the things that make us feel safe. A home, a person, a memory, a moment of peace. But a home is not a place from which no one is allowed to leave. It is a place to which someone chooses to return. And kindness, like the sound of a bell, was never meant to remain inside one room. It must be allowed to travel. So, if you ever find yourself on a winter road after the light has faded, listen carefully. Beyond the wind, beyond the soft fall of snow, you may hear one clear note in the distance. It may be nothing more than a loose piece of metal moving beneath an old roof. Or it may be an invitation, a reminder that somewhere ahead, a fire is still burning, a bowl is waiting near the hearth, and the door is open. And for tonight our story ends here. Thank you for sharing the fire with me. Rest well, traveler. Good night.